And welcome to the Heartland Daily Podcast. This is the Stopping Socialism TV and the Stopping Socialism Project, part of the Heartland Daily Podcast of video and audio for all of you out there that are fans of the Heartland Institute and freedom. And today we have a special edition of it. We're going to talk about the Great Reset, which is something you're going to be hearing a lot more about from the Heartland Institute, and you may have started hearing some about it from other organizations and from other media outlets, like the Glenn Beck radio program has been talking about this a lot. And the Heartland Institute's really been leading the leading intellectuals on this. We've been talking about the Great Reset for quite a while, and this is going to be a very big issue coming up in 2021. So for today, our guests, we have two of them. My name is Jim Lakely. I'm the vice president of the Heartland Institute. And discussing the Great Reset with us today is Chris Talgo. He is an editor at the Heartland Institute who also works on our Stopping Socialism program here at Heartland. And we have with us Darren Brady Nelson, who is a libertarian intellectual who we are proud to also call a policy advisor at the Heartland Institute. And he's also the chief economist at Liberty Works. Gents, welcome to the podcast, and let's get talking. Hey, Darren, how are you?
Oh, good, thanks. How are you gentlemen going?
Doing really well. All things considered, because it seems that there's some pretty bad stuff coming down the line, and it's called the Great Reset. So, Chris, why don't you kind of start our conversation off a little bit here?
So, Darren, the World Economic Forum has released, their Great Reset plan, and it seems that it is gaining a lot of traction. Seems like it's being more embraced by world leaders. Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, recently endorsed it. Joe Biden recently named John Kerry as his climate envoy, and he's been an outspoken advocate of the Great Reset. And he says it's going to happen, and it's going to happen soon with great intensity. So, just from a general perspective, what do you think this would mean for the U.S. economy?
Well, this could not come at a worse time, obviously. This is in large part inspired by the COVID pandemic, and of course, it's actually more so inspired because this has got a huge economic element to it. It's basically another attempt to centralize the economy. Now, it's not necessarily centralizing in the sense of old-style Soviet centralization, but it's in the sense of what we've seen in 2020 with the lockdowns, where you get local, state, and federal government, and also particularly large businesses in lockstep on locking down things and taking, just unprecedented measures in a time of no war.
Yeah. So actually, I want us to back up a little bit here and talk about what is the Great Reset. In general, it is a plan by global leaders to take advantage of the COVID crisis, which they had also done with the climate crisis, the so-called climate crisis, as an opportunity to reset the global economy. And we talked about this, myself, Justin Haskins, who runs our Stopping Socialism program here at Heartland, and Donnie Kendall, the host of the In the Tank podcast, who also works on the Socialism Project here at Heartland. And we talked about how it shouldn't be able to happen in the United States, that freedom, that liberty is the enemy of the Great Reset, that you can't reorder an economic system if people have freedom. You can only do that and control if you have the power to control people's lives and the way they live, the way business is operated, the way let's just say wealth is distributed across an economy. And I think you can only start something like the Great Reset, which is really a command and control structure. It's socialism on steroids. It's communism light, but what it really means is government control over not just the economy, but society, because you can't control economic activity is life. That's what life is. All life, everything you do. And Darren, as an economist, you know this as well as anybody, you tend to always think of things in economic terms, that, living life is an economic question. You can measure it in that way. And so you can't control an economy. You can't reorder an economic system away from capitalism into something else without controlling the people. And so freedom is the enemy of the Great Reset. Freedom is the enemy of control, and it's not compatible with each other. So in order for this to happen globally, the United States has to be part of it. And will the United States be part of it and still be free? I think that's a fundamental choice here. And these sound like, these are very grave questions that we're dealing with here. I tend to be skeptical that Americans will put up with this, that they will actually lay down for implementing the global Great Reset. But however, we have seen in this last year in 2020, a lot of Americans just lay down and take it with these COVID lockdowns. They have decided that governments can arbitrarily decide that this business is open and this business isn't, that this person can live freely and this person cannot. And it tends to be the elites who get to live freely and the rest of us who are not allowed to live freely. And what's interesting about this, to kind of tie it all in together here, is that, you say the words "the Great Reset," and our media elites in this country will accuse you of trying to spread a conspiracy theory. I predict very soon that it will be the case that Twitter will start to, if they have not already done it, shadow banning the words "the Great Reset" so that it won't be shared with people. And I find that hilarious because, in fact, the New York Times just basically the other day had said that the Great Reset is some kind of grand conspiracy theory. Yet, 2 weeks ago or a month ago, it was the cover story on Time magazine that said at the very top, "The Great Reset." Yeah. So Darren, kind of throwing all that out there in a bit of a fire hose. Do you think that the Great Reset, that this idea that the global elites can influence and frankly fundamentally change the American economy and society, do you think that's plausible?
Yes, it's completely plausible. In fact, it's happening already. And you should see sort of the glee when you read some of these documents from the World Economic Forum. You mentioned Time had a cover story. Well, the World Economic Forum has a whole website devoted to it. It's there. I looked this morning. In fact, their next meeting early next year is going to be all about the Great Reset. So obviously it's not a conspiracy theory whatsoever. It's a conspiracy reality. And you're dead right. It certainly has a huge economic aspect to it, but it's much broader. It's to give you its full title, it's actually called The Great Reset of Capitalism, right? Mm. So obviously that's economic in nature, but capitalism, as we know, is so heavily tied up, at least proper capitalism is tied up with the idea of freedom that, again, you're right. It's really, a huge and direct assault on freedom. And they have a glee for it because, as you also mentioned, a lot of people, the sort of people you expect wouldn't just lie down for these sorts of, say, lockdown measures and other related measures, largely have. Now, that doesn't mean they'll continue to lie down. And I have at least some decent hope that they won't in 2021. They've got away with it largely in 2020, although not completely, obviously. We've seen protests here and there in Michigan or the other night in Staten Island, for instance. But hopefully we'll talk about this, as the conversation goes. But it's actually much scarier than some, attempt to bring back the days of the Soviet Union. They're using a much smarter model, but also a more deadly model of the Beijing model, which is, this kind of mix of socialism and crony capitalism, which, and I don't want to throw this word out because people throw this word out because it's used to attack things in a kind of stupid way, but it actually is a fascist model. This is the fascist model of the economy and culture. If you look at the way Mussolini operated, there's some principles of socialism. We'll keep the commanding heights, running of our friends running the big corporations and all that. I guess the nicer title to fascism is corporatism. So it's more of that. But it is certainly going to be a heavy control model that's going to rely not just on government, but it's going to rely on big tech and others, big banks, big pharma, and all that sort of stuff.
Darren, one of the things that they've been really pushing is this idea of replacing shareholder capitalism with what they deem stakeholder capitalism. Could you just give us a little more background and what you think that means?
Well, I started to touch on it. It's basically, like I said, it's basically bringing the old school Mussolini model, but actually, like I said, more so the Beijing model of things. Stakeholder really means, crony capitalism on steroids. So it's not so much shareholders and customers and entrepreneurs driving the economy, which you'd expect, obviously, under free market capitalism, but it's what you see now. And big tech are the perfect examples of that. They get heaps of government favors to give them, cartel power in that market, and they buy off, and a combination of they buy off politicians. Plus, there's just a lot of politicians who are just on board with these sorts of ideas in the first place. So, some don't literally need to be bought off. And when I say bought off, obviously campaign donations, all that sort of stuff, which is usually legal. I mean, probably there aren't too many examples of illegal buying off, but it's the legal buying off, which, in many ways is scarier, because even if you catch it, it doesn't matter. It's legal, and they can explain it away. So stakeholder capitalism, really is taking crony capitalism to new heights. And it's using what Beijing has done as a great example, because, technology will play a key part. How in China they have this rating system of, like if you have a good rating, your life will be much better. The government will give you less hassles. You'll have more job opportunities. But if you don't play along, you don't play nicely, your ranking goes down. You're going to struggle to get jobs. You'll be banned from, sort of websites and emails. You might even be banned from using a bus, that type of stuff.
That's a really interesting aspect. So in China, they have their social credit system, and one of the big drivers of the Great Reset is that they want to remake the social contract. So do you see like a direct correlation between those two?
Yeah, it's all the interesting thing. It also makes it harder to wrap your head around the whole Great Reset and what it means, because it's brought together a lot of stuff at once, including things you mentioned.
Yes.
Sadly, they want to go even further, because they have like great visions of technology, not only be able to control us better. So basically, all the social engineering ideas that didn't quite work out, in the Soviet Union and some other places, now they have high hopes because of technology, but they also have high hopes of how technology interacts with biology and chemistry too, which is, obviously where big pharma comes into, because obviously big pharma is not only chemicals, but they're biochemicals as well. And obviously, that starts to overlap with pandemics and vaccines and all these sorts of things, because, obviously they'll start doing things like, you can travel if you took the vaccine we approve of, or, we'll make you take this vaccine, but maybe not literally make you through like the police, the old style sort of communist approach, but through the new Beijing approach, if you like.
Darren, you're a libertarian economist. We've known each other for quite a while, and we've had a lot of really fun conversations about liberty. And I just want to, bring it back to the idea that this seems to be inconceivable that it would happen in the United States, that the American people would put up with this, that they would allow basically the suspension of their constitutional rights in order to implement these things. Because when the World Economic Forum talks about the Great Reset and that they have to take this opportunity, the Premier of Canada, Justin Trudeau, he said in September, it's a video that has, I think you can still share it on Twitter these days, where he talks about the coronavirus pandemic being an opportunity to bring about a great reset. And so, the global leaders are on board. They've been talking about this, as you mentioned, for a while, kind of not, I wouldn't say in secret. It's been, it's been hidden in plain sight, I think is the better way to put it. But they really do believe that they can and will reset society in a better way. I think most people are fine with the way they live their lives now. What justification is there? What economic justification are they giving to necessarily reorder the way all of us live our lives? What's so bad now? I think most Americans certainly are very happy with free market capitalism. They're very happy with the way life is, and they don't want to have their lives dictated and directed by people not just far away in the United States, but in faraway lands?
Look, this is always going to be a combination of, they use a lot of half-truths, basically. And to be more honest, it's partial truths. So yeah, we got hit by a pandemic, people died. Now the evidence suggests probably, the sort of people who died were obviously people who already had comorbidities. They're, obviously very much senior citizens. And statistically, if you look at the past 10 years, well, they were probably going to die of flu or something else anyway, right? So to what extent, we actually have excess deaths? That's certainly a big open debate at the moment. But they're going to use all sorts of things. I've seen, looking at the World Economic Forum website, they use a lot of the same sort of phrases. They talk about racism, for instance, of course. So, obviously in 2020, we now have systemic racism, which, perhaps we didn't have before. Poverty is out of control. Of course, they don't talk about, well, that's because you kind of lock down things and, people lost their jobs, and particularly small to medium-sized businesses. They talk about inequality, but of course they jump to blaming, what's left of free market capitalism in 2020. And there hasn't been a whole lot in 2020. When I think of free market capitalism, obviously, I think particularly obviously of small and medium-sized businesses who don't get special favors to then become monopolies or cartels like some of the larger ones do. And again, government's always at the center of these things. I'm not blaming capitalism for creating monopolies and cartels, because I don't think it does. That it takes government to make that happen. And I think there's 100+ years of good economics in history to show it. So they're bringing everything together. It's not a coincidence that the BLM stuff has really gone to great heights. In the lockdowns, it all happened at the same time. So the left are trying to bring everything together under this one umbrella, the Great Reset. And if that fails, they're going to come up with something else. So we'll have to be on guard. If we manage to defeat this, we're going to have to be on guard for the next thing. And you mentioned, well, I guess two things. They have high hopes because they basically turned a lot of people into sheep, apparently, for this year. So they have high hopes they can carry on with that next year. And as you can see, I mean, nobody, particularly in the blue states and cities at the moment, no one's talking about getting rid of any of the COVID stuff. So, and I think you'll find that once the COVID cases and deaths and hospitalizations go back down again, they're not gonna let the boot off our throats.
Yeah, Darren, you look at what's going on in Los Angeles right now, where they're taking this to a whole new level with, you cannot ride a bike with someone outside your household. You cannot go walking with someone outside your household. I think you're right. They're just trying to condition people to be sheep, and they're using COVID as, this guise to, implement this global plan that they've had for, decades. And some of them are actually being really honest about it, saying that this is an opportunity. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, that's probably one of the key differences, I guess, this year in particular, is they're really not making much of an effort to hide things. I guess they largely think they've won. And this election, whether Biden won this thing legally or illegally, they're pretty confident he's going to be sitting in the White House, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of the final culmination, because Trump America really would be a humongous impediment to the Great Reset. Humongous. I mean, not just because America itself, but then, that obviously spreads out, that gives a bit more sort of cojones to Australia and the UK, and other countries to start going, all right, we're happy to go along with Trump. And obviously it's a huge foil to China, which is I think they're not just, China isn't just the model for this, but I think they're certainly a driving force behind it. Now, whether they're a driving force behind it in the sense, they're trying to make the rest of the world like China, or whether they're trying to actually destroy the economies and the societies of places like the US, I'm not sure yet. Maybe they're hedging their bets. Maybe they're going like, either way, we're going to be happy, from sort of Beijing's perspective. So like everything that's just has really come to a head in 2020. And now the question is, will it come to, is that the trajectory we're on, from 2021, or will people in the U.S. and elsewhere in the world? Because Americans certainly have a better record, at least on the right side of politics, for standing up against this sort of stuff. But they're not alone. I mean, we've had lots of COVID protests in the UK. There's certainly been ones that have been tried to be implemented in Australia, because they've had some of the, like the state of Victoria has had the most draconian measures, certainly in the Western world. And then again, they start building on these things and start doing other things that they want to do. Like in the state of Victoria, they now are trying to pass a law that because the population hasn't had an uprising with the COVID lockdowns there, they're now trying stuff like, well, we're going to have this law that says if anybody attempts to convince a child that the sex they are is the sex they are, that's a crime, including, and it's particularly targeted at churches. And obviously you saw in the U.S., I can't remember, it was mentioned earlier about the Constitution. Well, we've seen, I wouldn't say go so far to say the Constitution's dead, because we'll see what we'll see what happens, in some upcoming cases in the Supreme Court. But it's certainly looked at this year, because the First Amendment does not give any exemptions to pandemics for free speech, doesn't give any exemptions for freedom of assembly, and it certainly doesn't give any exemptions for freedom of worship. Yet we saw local and state governments, not the federal government, but local and state governments essentially ignore the First Amendment.
Yeah, this gets back to resist, right? This is this gets back to it. And you're right, Darren, that it's not just America. I'm biased. I'm an American, and so I think the United States, and frankly, I think it's indisputable that the United States is the beacon of freedom across, for the world. And
it is.
And you're right that the First Amendment the First Amendment guarantee of freedom of assembly does not have a COVID exception, and we are seeing some cracks in the crackdown of people gathering in a few cases now. And I think it's incumbent upon Americans, especially, just like during the Cold War, the United States, as Ronald Reagan, who's on a stamp behind me right here, talked about the shining city on a hill, that we are a beacon of freedom, and especially in the darkest days of the Cold War, all those poor people trapped behind the Iron Curtain looked to America for inspiration, and eventually, it took decades, the Iron Curtain fell. I don't know if the Great Reset is certainly not going to be an iron curtain. I think it's going to be more like a velvet curtain or a plush doll curtain, because instead of seizing power, instead of seizing the rights and the natural rights of the people around the world, they're going to basically hug them to death. At least they're going to try to make it seem that way, because the way they're going to reorganize our economic systems is to make it, quote unquote, more equitable, or you have to redistribute the wealth. You're not going to create wealth that way, of course. You basically, if your mindset, and this again, I think, Darren, maybe you could talk about from an economic standpoint, you being an economist, when you start concentrating on redistributing wealth instead of creating wealth, you kill the creation of wealth, and you basically end it, and then you start to go on a long decline. And it goes it goes pretty quickly too, because there's this sense, I think, that these global elites, they're standing at the top of a mountain, and they think they climbed there, but they were flown there, and from those heights, they think that they've created it, like the old cliche, I was born on third base and thought I hit a triple. They think that they created this wonderful society when they didn't. We did. The people did. Freedom did. And so now that they're at the top, they think they can now redistribute it, and everything else will be fine. But that's not how economics works. And once you start redistributing, you end the creation of abundance.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's an excellent summary. That's exactly sort of the essence of the difference between a flourishing sort of free market capitalism economy versus a sort of deteriorating crony capitalist through to socialist economies, right? And I can't remember the exact phraseology, but as the late great Baroness Margaret Thatcher said, eventually you run out of other people's money. So they're going to take from 4 years, putting aside the lockdowns, 4 amazing economic years from under the Trump administration, which then flowed out into some of the other world economies as well, depending on which one. And yeah, they think somehow the policies of lower taxes, lower regulations had nothing to do with why, obviously they first say that the economy wasn't good, which they know is incorrect. But then they might then say, oh, well, it wasn't because of Trump. They inherited from Obama. Obama was just a repeat of the sort of Carter administration in terms of the economy. It's far worse than the Carter administration because, Carter didn't put in place all his friends at the top of the FBI, the CIA, the Pentagon, and all that, which we're now paying for now. But they do it, the economics of Joe Biden and Obama were very similar to Jimmy Carter. It was a stagnation, essentially. So basically, at best, if Biden's president and they do the things they say they're going to do, depending obviously to a huge extent on what happens in the Senate Georgia runoffs, we're going to get this at best this stagnating sort of Obama-Biden economy. But what Biden's talking about now as president is far worse than the stuff that him and Obama were doing 8 years ago from an economic perspective, and probably actually sort of more broadly than just an economic perspective, obviously, with stacking the Supreme Court, etc. So exactly, incentives are key. Incentives are key, and a lot of these people, whether they admit it or not, that's hugely important. And the economy just won't keep on rolling on under sort of great reset conditions. And just one more thing, as you said, yeah, I totally agree. I mentioned Australia, I mentioned other countries, and none of them are going to, sort of become the new America. If America falls, maybe there might be a new America someday, but we're talking not just years, maybe decades, maybe centuries before there's anything like a new America arising. Like a place with the principles, what America was founded on. Even then, I'm not particularly confident.
Well, we're still really the only country, and you're more of an international person than I am, Darren. But America is still the only country that has a constitution that laid out right from the beginning that humans have natural rights. They're given by God, or if you don't believe in God, they're just naturally inherent in all human beings, and that there are certain things that you are entitled to that the government cannot infringe upon. The United States Constitution, written more than 200 years ago, laid that out very clearly. In fact, one of the things I think is a blessing from God was that the framers of the Constitution, many of them didn't think that a Bill of Rights was necessary. They thought it was dangerous to produce a Bill of Rights, actually, because people would assume that only those 10 things are protected and everything else can be infringed upon. And after deliberation, they said, no, I think these rights are important enough to delineate specifically to make sure that people don't have their right to free speech and assembly and their freedom of worship infringed upon, and also quartering foreign soldiers. But you don't get into that much anymore these days. But if you look at the constitutions around the world, and this is why ideas like the Great Reset come out of places like Europe or Asia, because if you look at the constitutions in the modern Western world, none of them are like the American Constitution that I'm aware of, and they also they tend to want to ensconce in their constitutions what are called positive rights, what the government isn't, in other words, what the people are entitled to from their government. So it establishes this mindset among people that the government is there, that the government is there to give them their rights. And so they have a right, the government can just decide to change those rights at any time. Where in the United States, it's the other way around. We are a people with a government. Not the other way around. We are not a government. It's not a government with its people. We are not ruled. We are represented, and we decide for ourselves the way we are going to move forward. Many other, even Western countries, enlightened, modern Western countries, do not even have that. They don't have that in their DNA. But only the United States really does. I mean, maybe Australia as well, which you're familiar with, Darren, and Great Britain. But for the most part, it's in America's DNA, but not so much around the rest of the world. And that's where I think, the ideas like the Great Reset can get a lot of momentum.
Oh, I totally agree. Look, there's elements to the American Constitution and the Australian Constitution, but it's not quite this sort of heavily principled constitution based on, as you mentioned, key concepts like natural law and natural rights. Again, working both ways, whether whether you believe in God or not. That concept is pretty solid because it knows that human nature doesn't change. And one of the sort of things I was reading about the Great Reset was kind of the history and sort of how the UN is obviously highly tied up with all this sort of stuff. In particular, UNESCO, actually, before the IPCC and some of that sort of stuff, UNESCO is a key part of this Great Reset philosophy. And Julian Huxley was kind of the first leader of it. And I think it was his brother who wrote The Brave New World. And, this guy is a eugenicist, right? And eugenics is coming back. They've renamed it transhumanism. So watch out for that term. The Great Reset people and people like that, even if they don't use the word Great Reset over time, will start using transhumanism. So this is ways. So basically, Julian Huxley, loved Marxism, but he said, look, unless you really can change human nature, it's not gonna succeed. So now these people are reinvigorated because they think, the ideas of Marx, etc., because of technology and biotechnology, they have a shot at, getting this brave new world at some, sooner rather than later, because they also become impatient, with the, so the slow Fabian socialist crawl towards more and more statism, which, has been happening in the US too, except with the big exception of things starting to go the other way under Trump, of course. But, to put it all in a historical perspective, the progressive movement has been winning really for the past 120 years. Occasionally we've had a Reagan, a Thatcher, and then obviously recently a Trump come along. And, doesn't mean that we can't actually not just turn the tide for 4 to 8 years. I think we could turn it for much longer and maybe turn the tide for good, but we haven't yet.
Darren, one of the more underreported elements of the Great Reset is the idea of a world currency and a crypto world currency. Can you just describe like the impact of that? What would that have on world economics?
Look, I'm open to cryptocurrencies because the first one, Bitcoin, was really based on a person who had an affinity for Austrian economics, of Ludwig von Mises and von Hayek and people like that. So in other words, it was an attempt to almost bring back a gold standard, but obviously through the private sector without any sort of government support for it. So, the concept that, money just can't be printed out of thin air with no connection back to actual savings and real wealth, right? So Bitcoin was trying to do that through a computer program. Actually, they tried to actually go one step further, whereas gold can still be produced in really small amounts. Like the bulk of gold has been around for centuries, right? So the beauty of that means you can't just inflate the gold money supply, right? You can mine a little bit here and there because it's just scarce. Bitcoin actually tried to go a bit further and then, actually reduce the supply of Bitcoins over time, right? But so far, it's just become an investment vehicle, which is nice. It hasn't really become a currency, an alternative to fiat currency, which is, dollars, et cetera, that are unconnected to gold. And now, anytime you get people like Facebook getting into the market, I get more and more suspicious. And then, you start hearing even central banks, who are obviously massive opponents of cryptocurrencies, are now rethinking it, which then tells me, the future of it. I'm not suggesting the underlying sort of programming and algorithms that can be applied to. Apparently, there's a lot of great applications beyond cryptocurrencies for the sorts of programming underneath it. That still might have some great hope for protecting us from censorship or being monitored by governments. So that still has some great hope. But yeah, I don't have a great sort of hope for cryptocurrencies. But just a quick one. So people should know really the importance of money and money supply and credit supply in this. because the leftist ideas, particularly at the Great Reset, not only rely on sort of spending a lot of government money, doling out a lot of regulatory and legislative favors to big companies, big tech, etc., and also rely on hopefully taxing us a lot more from their perspective, hopefully. But probably the key thing to this is the continued control of the money supply, and thus not letting cryptocurrencies take off in the private sector, uncontrolled by central banks and uncontrolled by governments.
Right. That's why I'm worried about their insistence on a one world currency. And we know that the IMF, the World Bank, a lot of the big players are in on this. So that's just one of the underreported but pretty dangerous aspects of it.
Oh yeah. So the centralization of I mean, money is fairly centralized at the moment, through International Bank of Settlements and other things. And the Fed is obviously a little bit of the de facto world central bank, not just the U.S. central bank. But yeah, if they took that centralization further, particularly under one currency, whether it was crypto or paper or whatever, the problem will be that it's going to be central and it's going to obviously be government controlled, and it's also going to have all their sort of like a small group of the big bank cartel involved. Yeah, that won't be good.
Right.
Yeah, we're running low on time, but I just wanted to maybe get your thoughts, both Chris and Darren, on this thought that I had. They want to replace shareholder capitalism, which is called free market capitalism, because you're, and the way the world works and the way economics works, with something called stakeholder capitalism. And they put the word stakeholder in quotes, or we would, because, well, who are the stakeholders? And they seem to be selling it on the idea, well, the downtrodden, we need a capitalism that helps the little guy and that sort of thing. It's a lie. It's not how it works. But as you were talking there, Darren, I was thinking back to my earlier question: how will Americans accept the idea that that a world government is going to reorder their lives and the way they live and the way they act, change their incentives, basically give them fewer choices? And then, the light bulb goes off. This is probably not going to happen from government. It's going to happen from the quote unquote private sector. It's going to happen. The stakeholders are Facebook. The stakeholders are the large corporations in the United States, which are getting even bigger. The pandemic has made Amazon and Apple and other huge tech giants some of the most powerful corporations in the history of civilization. And so I'd like to know, Darren, if you agree with me that if the Great Reset, if its aims have any chance in the United States, it's going to be coming through the private sector and not through government control, because the largest corporations in the world are buying into this, because as the stakeholders, the system, capitalism, has been rigged for them. And so they have great incentive to go along with the program because it benefits them above all.
Yeah, look, I agree. It comes clear when you read some of these documents from the World Economic Forum. They're not, they explicitly say they're not necessarily trying to grow the size of government. They're not necessarily, and they're certainly not trying to get rid of or shrink the private sector. What they're trying to do is what we saw in 2020, is where you get sort of like the commanding heights of the private sector, the big tech, big pharma, big banks, big media, big Hollywood, all that sort of stuff, working hand in hand with government. Now, it's always going to be a combination of, some of these people are Baptists in the sense that they're true believers and, government needs to have more control, or they, as good corporate citizens, need to control the citizenry some way. And then there's also the bootleggers, so Baptists and bootleggers, which a concept I'm pretty sure Jim's heard before. I'm not sure about you, Chris. And the bootleggers are the people who make money out of this, who make more money, I should say, than they would in a competitive free market capitalist system. And a free market capitalist system always leads towards competition. Anytime someone comes to dominate a market or a small group, they only dominate as long as the customers and the shareholders are happy. In other words, Microsoft or Apple are doing a good job and the prices are reasonable, right? Fine. In that case, domination of a market really doesn't matter. The problem is when they dominate through government favors, and obviously big tech is the most infamous with their Section 230, which is where their sort of protection jumps off from, and it's a huge protection. It allows them to cartelize the industry and make supernormal profits. So it starts going in a bit of a feedback circle, in the sense that when you have a protected market, you can obviously make these much bigger profits. You can also afford to go woke without going broke, right? Because in a competitive market, you just can't go woke for the sake of going woke. It's like that's a privilege for the rich kids, and the richest kids are obviously people like big tech. And obviously bureaucrats too have jobs for lives who make, way higher salaries than most everybody, even people in corporations often. So yeah, they want this lovely hand-in-hand corporatist sort of model on steroids. And like I said, I mean, I know no one likes the word. People on the right don't like the word fascist because we are always being called fascists for no good reason. When in fact, we care about the poor because we know that free market capitalism is the thing that helps the poor the best. Why is that? Because it just makes more stuff available at a lower price. Even if you're not working or you're not doing much work, you will start getting a higher and higher real income. And obviously most people want to work anyway. So it creates more job opportunities and creates lower prices. So it has this thing where your wages are going up and your input costs are going down. And crony capitalism and the Great Reset are going to do the exact opposite. And it's really a redistribution of income. Same thing. Every time you see a leftist program, it's ultimately about redistributing income from the majority of us through to a small elite group in the government and an elite group in some of the big corporations.
Yep.
Well, the great reset is coming one way or the other, and it's just a matter of what do you do about it? Who's going to resist it? Who's going to stand up against it? I refuse to be ruled. Chris Talgo puts his fist up in solidarity. Mm-hmm. It's just a matter of whether you remember that you are a free person in this country, and that COVID has taken a lot of our assumed rights away, and we have to start standing up and taking them back because the government's not going to give them back. You have to take them.
Well, I have a lot of confidence that the American people will be standing up in 2021. Whether Trump has a miraculous win through the court system or whether it's Biden, I think the American people are going to be standing up because, I've also done, you mentioned I'm an international person. I'm an American originally, but I certainly live and travel internationally. And one thing that disappointed me with Hong Kong over the years was, even though it was actually the most free market society on the planet for a long time, much more free market than the US, but they didn't have the culture. They didn't have the constitution and the culture that the US does. But the fact that the Hong Kong people are standing up to, let's face it, much bigger tyrants at this stage, than Biden might be, standing up to Xi, fills me with a confidence that the Americans will definitely be standing up, given the culture and the history of the U.S.
Yep. Well, stay tuned to this podcast for more information about the Great Reset moving forward. You basically should just go ahead and subscribe now to the Heartland Daily Podcast fire hose feed, because there's going to be a lot of discussion on this topic, because there is a lot to unpack, and you need to be prepared and you need to be informed. Thank you for listening to the Heartland Daily Podcast today. Thank you, Chris Talgo, editor at the Heartland Institute and participant in our Stopping Socialism project. And of course, our guest, Darren Brady Nelson, the chief economist at Liberty Works, and also a policy advisor at the Heartland Institute.
I'm giving the Winston Churchill V for victory.
From your lips to God's ears. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.